after Adam and Eve are exiled from the Garden of Eden. They live for many years, hundreds of years, and they have lots of children. We're specifically told about 3 of them in Genesis 4. Eve gives birth to her firstborn Cain. She says, I've received a son from the Lord. And her second is called Abel. That has that sense in Hebrew of a breath of wind, suggesting sort of fragility there. Well, Abel and Cain bring sacrifices. Cain brings produce from the ground. He's a farmer. Abel brings the choicest, the best, the firstborn lamb. And his sacrifice is blessed and approved of. Cain is angry. God warns Cain. It says that sin is crouching at your door, waiting to devour you. Don't give in. But Cain goes out and murders his brother Abel in the field, bringing God's judgment on him. That scene where God asks him about his brother. And Cain famously asks, am I my brother's keeper? Cain is judged, and there's a new son born, Seth, and we get the sense that Cain represents the sons, the offspring of man, and Seth reflects the sense of a godly generation of hope. That this is the line through whom hope will come. And then we go into Genesis 5, and I just wanted to highlight this before we move on in the story, because this is significant. We have this list of people, of descendants that are born to Cain. It's the first sort of generational list. And each time we have this statement, and he died. So that Genesis 5 has sometimes been referred to as a litany of death, the evidence that sin has come into the world, and with sin, death, that the penalty of death is now on us, that humans are mortal. And there's the suggestion there that these lives, people will do great things, heroic deeds, but each life finishes in death. And the question there, will death have the last word? And I wanted to highlight that because one of the things we want to think about when we're thinking about story, about narrative, and about the big story is, what type of story is it? Now, the ancient Greeks, classical Greece, had 2 big genres when they were thinking about plays and stories, and that's picked up by Shakespeare as well in his big plays. You either had comedy or tragedy. Let's take them in reverse order. So tragedy is a story that may have heroic deeds, may even have moments of joy and celebration in it, but ultimately ends in failure, in death, in disaster. So to take the Shakespeare examples, Hamlet is a classic of that genre, finishing with all sorts of plotting, and there's famous speeches, to be or not to be, alas, poor Yorick, you can say, well, all that kind of thing. But Hamlet finishes with this guy called Fortinbras arriving to conquer, to find everybody dead. It's a tragedy for Hamlet. His story ends in death. Comedy is the opposite of that. We're not meant to think comedy in terms of stand-up or slapstick or that kind of thing. There may be humour in it, but that's primarily not what it's about. Comedy is about a story that may have its twists and turns, that may have disasters and difficulties in it, but the heroes win out in the end. The good guys succeed. And so with comedy, the ending is always better than the beginning. And for Shakespeare, think A Midsummer Night's Dream, think Comedy of Errors, and that kind of thing. These plays to show that there is joy and celebration at the end finish often with a wedding celebration. So when we're looking at biblical theology and we're thinking about the church, the church's history, and we're thinking about what God is doing, then the big question is this: are we part of a comedy or a tragedy? And what you'll see is that there are stories within that are tragedy. Different periods in history where we see tragedy in the church. You may have experienced tragedy in your own life. And your own life story may be heading towards a tragic end if you have not trusted in Jesus. And in the Bible too, there are examples of these kind of tragic events, life that end in despair. King Saul, his life is a tragedy. Ananias and Sapphira, another example of a tragic story, a tragedy. But there are also stories that are examples of comedy. I think a great example of that is the story of Ruth. We may pick up on that later on. Ruth and Naomi. Naomi sets out from Bethlehem to find food in Moab, but her husband dies. Her sons die. She returns to Bethlehem and she says, "My name isn't Naomi, I'm not pleasant. My name is bitter." But of course the story is with Ruth marrying Boaz, of a family provided for, becoming part of the ancestral line of King David, and through David to Jesus. And it finishes, of course, with that great wedding celebration and the birth of Boaz and Ruth. Or you've got the book of Job or Job. Again, there's tragedy. Job experiences great suffering as Satan, the accuser, tests him. But we're told that at the end, God gives back even more than Job had at the start. His life at the end is better than at the beginning. It's comedy. And I want to suggest that the whole Bible narrative, and in fact the whole of history for God's people, specifically for God's people, therefore the history of the church, is comedy. And yes, in terms of the history of the church and the history of your local church, it may feel like it's more comedy in the sense of humour, of something that could be in a sitcom, that kind of thing. But actually, we are part of a bigger story, a bigger narrative. By the way, one of the things that I often say is this: that if you want to get a church away from being distracted by the kind of the soap operas of squabbles and divisions, or what's going on here or there, to lift them out of the soap opera, get them to see the bigger, greater drama, the greater theatre, that they don't get to just watch, but get to be part of. And then The way that we do that is to take them to what the Bible says about history, what God is doing. And of course, that's what we're going to be doing. So, a little spoiler alert: the story seems to be descending down a sort of a downward slope here. This litany of death, but the promise that we've already heard mentioned, the one who will crush the serpent, tells us that there is a victor, a conqueror coming, and that is good news, that the story has a happy ending. Of course, the Bible ultimately finishes with the wedding feast of the Lamb and the glory of the new creation. One of the things that we do as God's people, and we do through biblical theology, is we find our place in that story. Are we part of that big drama? Are we going to enjoy that happy ending? Thanks for listening and watching in today.